This video is part of a series on police violence. For the previous videos, click here. And now we'll pick up exactly where I left off in the last video. There are a lot of possible ways to cut down on police violence. I'm going to address a few of the more common ideas, some potential drawbacks, and then discuss the change that I believe would create the greatest amount of improvement. Two of the most common solutions are community policing and defunding the police. However, while both of these solutions sound good on paper, they are actually mutually exclusive and cancel each other out. I'm going to explain why, but let me first explain both concepts in case you're not familiar with them. Community policing involves having cops patrol the same areas each day and spend more time helping out the community and going above and beyond on calls. In theory, this will allow officers to establish relationships with community members and become more integrated and knowledgeable about the neighborhood they serve. This should make them better at understanding the community's needs, and having connections can greatly assist them in investigating and de-escalation. Defunding the police involves setting aside police funding for other assets, such as trained social workers that might be able to better handle certain emergencies. This could allow mental health professionals to deal with calls regarding suicide, welfare checks, and mental health episodes, while the police are free to only respond to calls that might actually require someone to be arrested. The idea to defund the police is not about simply sucking resources away from police to leave them out to dry. It's about shifting some of those responsibilities onto specialists that are better equipped to handle those tasks. This can make an officer's job easier by allowing them to focus on fewer types of calls. In addition, the funding can be used to set up more crisis centers and community programs that can help reduce the overall amount of crime, which would then mean we require less police. Or at least that's how these ideas work in theory. In practice, community policing and defunding the police are mutually exclusive ideas because of one very important word: money. Community policing requires officers to spend more time delicately sorting out conflicts and dedicate a larger part of their day to helping and being a part of the community. Officers would focus on building friendships and being generally helpful instead of accomplishing specific tasks like arrests or investigations. This means that officers need a lot more time in their day and can't afford to be rushed from call to call, which is the current reality for many officers. Lightening their workloads would necessitate hiring a lot more total officers, and this would require a significant amount of money. If you want community policing, be prepared to give police departments a bunch of taxpayer funds. If you're in favor of defunding the police, understand that you will have worse community policing. You will have fewer officers covering larger areas, and many of your programs to reduce crime will not pay off in the short to medium term. That means that a smaller number of officers will likely be more rushed and will be even less integrated into local communities. And a lot of those calls might require a social worker to be accompanied by an officer in case violence does break out, meaning that some calls might now require twice the staff. And the entire program could end up costing more than the system we currently have. In addition, limiting officers to calls that may require violence reinforces the idea in officers' minds that they exist solely to dish out violence. And that's going to further entrench warrior mentality into the fabric of policing. If we explicitly tell officers that their job is now restricted to only calls that might require force, they will expect to respond to every call with force. Now, if you want community policing, be prepared to cut other government programs or raise taxes, because it could take serious money to make a difference, depending on the budget and requirements of your department. If you want to defund the police, be prepared for police relations with the community to worsen. If you want community policing while also funding social service workers and crisis programs, then understand how much money that will take. Police departments already soak up a lot of funds. In my town, the police department makes up almost 25% of the general fund, which is over $250 from every man, woman, and child in my city. If you increase that budget and start funding a fleet of social workers, you either institute a tax hike that will risk your political career, or you throw your city into a financial black hole. Now, I'm not saying that either community policing or defunding the police are necessarily bad ideas. I'm saying that they both have side effects. Implementing one of them would be a challenge. Implementing both of them would take an amount of political will that most constituencies don't have. Of course, while I think that defunding the police is a generally fraught idea, I will say that my wife and I have been the victim of 3 separate hit and runs, and absolutely no one has been given so much as a ticket. Which does beg the question, what exactly the current level of funding is even for, and what police even do? Which is a perfect segue into this video's sponsor, my undying rage and thirst for justice. If my tax dollars go towards police departments with overly violent mentalities, more obsessed with catching the bad guy than seeking justice, then why do the departments I interact with seem incapable of either? When someone passes over a double yellow line into oncoming traffic, almost causes a head-on collision, runs back over a median, hits my vehicle, and then speeds off through residential neighborhoods, blowing through stop signs and driving over lawns in an attempt to get away, why does a police officer let this person drive off without even a ticket? Remember, if you cause an accident in North Carolina, just flee the scene, because apparently no one cares. We've been hit 3 times and always gotten identifying information, and nothing ever happens. 2 of those times were thanks to Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, who apparently decided that beating the crap out of DeThor and Graham is as close to law enforcement as they ever wanted to get. Apparently, paying those officers over twice as much as frontline Army infantry isn't enough money for them to do their jobs. Thank you to my undying rage for sponsoring this channel. Now, back to the video. Another common idea, and one that I hinted at earlier, is ending qualified immunity. A handful of states have already found clever legal ways to do this, and the sky has not fallen. Colorado, New Mexico, Connecticut, and New York City have all eliminated qualified immunity. And while there have been complaints from some individuals, officers are still almost always protected by indemnification, meaning that even if they do get sued, their department will be paying nearly all the costs. Oh yeah? If all the money is being paid by the department, why would you want cops to get sued even more? If you're not even punishing them, then all you're trying to do is bankrupt departments and waste taxpayer dollars. Obviously, the purpose of this is not to bankrupt departments. I just complained about solutions that spend too much public money. You think I want it all going to lawsuits? The idea behind ending qualified immunity is that the departments will be forced to fire their more problematic officers to avoid wasting money. Any officer that's continually getting sued for constitutional violations becomes a much greater liability. In theory, this could force departments to weed out the bad cops and adjust their training programs to rely less on force, or end up losing all of their funding to court losses and higher insurance premiums. Obviously, the financial pressures to clean up their departments already exist because there are still some lawsuits that are effective, but ending qualified immunity would hopefully increase the financial pressure and result in departments taking greater action. In addition, it allows victims to more easily access compensation that they actually deserve. Imagine dealing with lifelong physical and mental problems because of police abuse, and a judge tells you, you were abused in a totally new way, so hit the road, you get nothing. Another idea is to change the training that officers receive to focus less on killing people and more on de-escalation and crisis management. One such program is ICAT, which focuses on situations in which someone may be experiencing a crisis. It uses role-playing and scenario training to teach officers how to de-escalate conflict.
Utilizing scenarios that involve persons in crisis allows them to try and, in a way, test the tools they were given the day before in the classroom and see, in many cases, they're already utilizing some of those tools and skills in the work they do every day.
While it advertises itself as being for situations in which the other person does not have a firearm, it's easy to see that it could still be potentially applied when there is a firearm, such as suicide attempts. If Ben Darby had had this kind of training, it's possible that he wouldn't have committed murder. And that's just one obvious example as to how these kinds of training programs could save lives. They can also be used to help create crisis intervention teams, which are far better equipped to deal with certain types of calls. These programs are great, but they don't exist in a vacuum. Ultimately, improvements in training and equipment consistently fall short of the goal. As an example, look at a case where a Las Cruces police officer, Jared Cosper, shot and killed a 75-year-old woman holding a knife. Instead of telling you about the incident, just click this and go watch it, because it's only a minute long. If it weren't for YouTube's copyright system, I would have just included the whole thing in this video. But first, know that upon arriving at the scene, the officer had been informed that the woman in question has dementia, is experiencing a mental health crisis, and has not yet hurt anyone.
Things that bother you never bother me. I feel happy and fine, ha-ha, living in the sunlight.
This officer had time because no one else was in immediate danger. This officer had help, as his partner was there, and the city had a crisis intervention team that could be called in. The officer had a taser, which never even left its holster. The officer had appropriate training, as he'd received 70 hours of crisis intervention training, in addition to his academy training, and had 9 years of police experience. The officer also had the appropriate knowledge, having been advised by the dispatcher that the woman had dementia and was experiencing a crisis. He had even witnessed family members standing mere feet from the woman when he first approached the house, demonstrating that she is not an immediate threat. He even spends his entire time at the doorway listening to her family's pleas of be careful with her and not to hurt her. Despite all of this, he spends 38 seconds pointing a gun while screaming at someone who doesn't speak English, fatally shoots her, and then fails to render aid. It doesn't matter what tools or training you give an officer. The officer had been taught how to deal with people in crisis, and he had the equipment to take the woman down with less than lethal means. He still shot her because he fundamentally does not think in terms of de-escalation or minimum force. Every tool he gets will be used to force compliance, because that is the mindset that he has been surrounded by his entire career. For every officer that undergoes crisis intervention training, there are many more that are exposed to warrior training. And unfortunately, warrior training is often the more appealing option. Telling someone that they're specially chosen by God to battle the forces of evil is a whole lot cooler than doing whatever this is.
Rick, I can see that you're upset and you have a lot going on right now in your life. We're here to help you, and we're here to get you services with the right people.
One of them makes you feel like the chosen one in an action movie, and the other one makes you feel like an overqualified therapist. And when someone signs up to stop crime and be a hero, it's easy to guess which one of these programs they're going to mentally latch onto. Even when you do give officers the right training, any warrior training that they've had, and any elements of warrior culture that they've been exposed to, often renders the good training null and void. And perhaps we could simply mandate that all training programs change, but as I demonstrated earlier, this can be very difficult to pull off. Law enforcement organizations are going to fight it tooth and nail because, in their minds, you're forbidding them from learning how to keep themselves safe. And even if you succeed in passing these mandates without being thrown out of office by the scruff of your neck, individual officers are still likely to do everything they can to continue and pass down the warrior mentality because it's so emotionally appealing, and it's simply what they're used to. It's how they're trained, and it's how their trainers were trained. And of course, with the fragmented nature of America's political power, banning warrior training in your city might be possible, but the rest of the country might not have changed. This means that law enforcement groups, both formal and informal, could still be championing a warrior culture to each other. I mean, just think of how culturally entrenched the phrase, "I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6, has become in law enforcement circles. And that's almost never present in formal officer training. It's just something that managed to arise out of a general cavalier attitude towards killing. Ultimately, the training and equipment that an officer receives is irrelevant compared to the culture and the mindset to which they've become accustomed. Any tool they're given will be used to win wars and force compliance, because that's how they think. When you believe yourself to be a hammer, anything you're given becomes a nail. The only way to truly fix the problem of police violence is by attempting to create a cultural shift to better define the role of police in society. Warrior training is powerful because it seeks to define police as a fraternity of sheepdogs engaged in an open war with those that prey on society. It's a clear, strong, and simple message that's easy to repeat and even easier to find moral absolution in. In short, it's the perfect propaganda. Instead of outlawing it, which just further convinces officers that the sheep are in denial, we need an equally powerful idea to replace it with. One of the leading ideas is to attempt to replace the warrior mindset with the guardian mindset. While the warrior mindset emphasizes getting the bad guys, making arrests, and stopping the wolves, the guardian mindset emphasizes human rights, protecting the community, and looking out for everyone equally. It's the difference between enforce laws and gain compliance and actually protect and serve. Police culture is no different from the culture of any other organization in its origin, implementation, or effect. And I've spoken about organizational culture at length in one of my previous videos. Culture is based on beliefs and assumptions that can have significant impact on the way you do your job and see the world. When a panel of retired officers discussed warrior versus guardian mindsets, they concluded that officers obviously need both, and you might be thinking that that's the obvious answer as well.
Throughout police work, there's always been a combination. It's been that officer that knows how to transition from one to the other in a seamless manner, use different tactics here versus different tactics there, de-escalate there, attack here.
It doesn't sound like they're giving us enough credit from being able to switch back and forth.
I think it's a false dichotomy to say guardian on one hand and warrior on the other hand. I tend to view the police as guardians, but they need the warrior training to deal with that situation.
This argument between one or the other is nonsensical. There's never been, I don't believe, a one or the other type of necessity.
Unfortunately, that's just not how mindset works. Your mindset is about the lens through which you view problems and the method by which you start looking for a solution. You cannot hold multiple competing mindsets simultaneously because then your mind isn't set. If you don't have a default way to approach a nuanced situation, you're not adaptable, you're just untrained. What mentality you have as a default is going to have an enormous impact on how you approach problems. If an officer gets called out to someone angrily pacing in a circle while holding a knife, you only have a few seconds on scene to decide how you're going to respond to that. A guardian mentality might default to, "Excuse me, sir, you've got some people concerned about you. Are you all right? Do you mind putting that knife away for me so I can help?" And that is a far cry from the warrior mentality approach of, "Drop the knife, show me your hands behind your back, don't move and get on the ground." One escalates, one de-escalates, and you fundamentally can't do both. There are nuanced situations that could be interpreted in various ways, and the mentality you have is going to determine your default approach to that situation. And that's not to say that someone with one of the mentalities is only capable of a single approach. If a warrior cop sees a 5-year-old girl crying in the corner, they're not going to scream, "Show me your hands!" And a guardian cop isn't going to respond to someone actively shooting at them with, "Do you want to talk about your feelings?" The obvious situations will always be obvious. But as any police officer will tell you, obvious situations are rare. Sometimes police officers will have to employ a high level of violence. But there's a difference between mindset and tactics. And it's a difference that a lot of officers seem to have trouble understanding. The advantage of being trained in a mindset is that it gives you a mental rubric for how to tackle more complex problems. Before you walk in the door, are you thinking about how to de-escalate, or are you thinking about how to enforce compliance? Is your goal to keep people safe or to get the bad guy? These differences in mindset can dramatically change the outcome of many confrontations. In addition, the panel of retired officers discussing mentality were all 100% indoctrinated into a warrior mindset. I encourage you to go watch the video and take note of the fact that in a discussion on guardian versus warrior mindset, there's absolutely no mention of protecting people, community safety, or being a shield for others. The entire discussion centered around being prepared to kill, winning the fight, and hunting the bad guys. If you think your organization or your department doesn't have a culture, you're wrong. You're just too deep in it to see the forest for the trees. And being immersed in a culture can have an enormous impact on the way you mentally frame problems. The officers involved in the panel likely thought that they could employ two different mindsets because they've been primed to think of everything as skills to acquire and additional weapons in your arsenal. Framing everything, including the concept of empathy, as tools in your belt and ways to get the job done, is exactly how warrior cops are trained to think. In trying to argue that they could use both mindsets, they unintentionally proved that they are solidly stuck in one. Also, compare the way the panel talks about the role of law enforcement with how an officer that actually has a guardian mindset talks about it.
We have to understand that at any moment it could all go to crap and we're going to have to take somebody's life before they take our life.
There is no routine interaction with the public. Anybody has the potential to be a combatant.
The mission has to be go find the bad guys and put the bad guys in jail before we have to turn into guardians. Track them, surveil them, put them in jail.
I see a police officer as someone who's out there to help you, not to arrest you every time. We get there after the fact. We still have to help you. Got to sometimes pick up those pieces and make sure people are okay. Dust them off and do what we can to make them better.
Sometimes if you just listen and talk and understand that you're dealing with people with emotions and have a more compassionate element to how you resolve issues.
If you didn't know better, you would almost think that these people have completely different jobs because their own descriptions of what they do are not compatible. That's why organizational culture is so important. Not only does it change the way officers respond to an unclear situation, but it also affects how they see their role in society and what goals their department pursues. If you have a warrior mindset, you might genuinely believe that your department needs automatic weapons, armor, MRAPs, attack choppers, and whatever else helps you hunt down the bad guys. If you have a guardian mindset, you might believe that it's much more important to have community outreach programs, mentoring in schools, better first aid, and more community involvement. These are wildly different approaches to law enforcement, and you can't always have both. Department budgets are finite, so when the choice comes down to an outreach program for disadvantaged youths to steer them away from crime, or the weapons to help you kill any disadvantaged youth that fall into crime, which one is your department going to choose? Now, I know that organizational culture might seem like a strange, nebulous concept, and it probably sounds a lot easier to take more concrete approaches to problems. It's tempting to think that passing a few laws, changing the use of force policy, and giving officers more de-escalation training will largely solve the problem. Unfortunately, that doesn't work, at least not alone. Organizational culture has the power to prevent any other solution from taking effect. To understand this better, let's take a closer look at the trouble surrounding the Minneapolis Police Department. In 2016, the city of Minneapolis provided officers with body-worn cameras. But when prosecutors that watched the footage noted that many officer reports were either completely inaccurate or outright fabrications, department leaders just didn't discipline anyone. Also in 2016, officers got in hot water after verbally antagonizing a man in their custody until the man kicked his legs in the direction of the officers. The two officers then held the man down and repeatedly punched him in the head before placing him face down on the pavement. When this started, the man was already in handcuffs and was being brought to the hospital. I tell you this because one of the involved officers reported that he was supposed to receive training to correct his behavior, but the department never gave him that training, and 6 years later, he admitted he still didn't understand what he did wrong. In 2019, the city of Minneapolis banned third-party warrior training. But a formal investigation found that it didn't matter. Warrior mentality already permeated official department training, and new hires were being trained by officers that already had a warrior mentality. The department effectively gave officers warrior training anyway. In 2020, Minneapolis Police Department's use of force policy was updated following the death of George Floyd. But the department, quote, provided no substantive training to officers about the new policy for over a year. Later in 2020, it was announced that the department would no longer be executing no-knock warrants. But the department simply ignored their own announcement and continued using them anyway. And when they eventually killed an innocent man during the execution of a no-knock warrant that they weren't supposed to be using, they publicly portrayed the victim as a criminal suspect, which he was not. Remember that all of these things happened at the same department within 4 years. At this point, ignoring and refusing to comply with mandatory policy changes is a Minneapolis Police Department annual tradition. So if you uncover bad officers, they won't be disciplined. If you change the training, it will be changed back. And if you change the policy, it will be ignored. A toxic organizational culture creates officers that are willing to sabotage, subvert, or just downright ignore any attempts at accountability. When department culture cares more about perpetuating a war on crime than it does about truth or justice, subverting policy and lying to the public are simply chalked up to the ends justifying the means, and sacrifices made for the greater good. Without changing the underlying attitudes and beliefs of individual officers, clinically implemented solutions will have no effect.
No behavioral mandate, new policy, or technology prescription can change the way we see others. Nor can these sterile measures equip officers with the ability to adapt in the moment to provide the approach each unique situation requires. The change in the way we see can not only transform a single situation, but can transform an entire community.
But if the power of culture is able to undermine any changes we make, how do we change the culture itself? If a bunch of departments already have the warrior mentality ingrained into them, isn't the culture just the culture? No. Culture can absolutely change, but doing so requires learning about the nuances of organizational culture. Different organizations operate best under specific cultures. While a tech startup might function very well with a highly innovative and risk-taking approach that constantly challenges the status quo, a bank doing the same thing would be very quickly shut down. Your organization, whether it be a private company, a bureaucracy, a military, or a police department, will always have a specific culture. If you don't give your organization a culture, it will spontaneously generate one. Allowing that to happen is very dangerous because a spontaneously generated culture is almost never the ideal culture for that organization, or it's not the culture you want it to have. As a result, culture should always flow from the top down so that it can be controlled and properly directed. In terms of police departments, this means that elected politicians will have to iron out policies and goals and then appoint police chiefs and commissioners who then change the training, policies, procedures, and incentives to slowly steer the ship in a new direction. And this is a change that requires sustained effort over a period of years or decades, as warrior-trained officers might be too stuck in their ways, and departments may be forced to wait for a generation of officers to retire before completing the transformation. Alternatively, you could fire everyone and rebuild the organization from scratch, but the amount of disruption and upheaval that causes means that that's usually more of a last-ditch effort. So we know that the culture has to be changed from the top down, but what does that look like? Does the police chief just say, be a guardian, and then the officers just do that? Unfortunately, no. We have to not just change the training, but also the values held by the organization and the stories and myths circulating among the officers. I already covered training a little while ago, but how do you change the values and internal dialogues of an organization? The values of any organization can most easily be seen by what's being tracked and what gets its members promoted and rewarded. For example, for enlisted military, physical training scores are a big part of promotions. meaning that if you want to advance your career, you have to be in shape. The military values fitness. Likewise, any infantry unit can probably tell you who their best marksmen are, as range performance is often tracked and posted, because the military values marksmanship. Now, if you ask an enlisted person who's the best juggler in their unit, they might not be able to tell you. Why? Because the military doesn't care about juggling, so nobody tracks it. So, what gets a police officer promoted? Well, it totally depends on the department. But what departments choose to value can have a significant effect on officers' actions. Earlier, I told you about the story of Detective Zachary Wester, who framed people for drug possession. But what I didn't tell you is that his motive was to get assigned to the Narcotics Task Force, and that his department gave out assignments and promotions based on your number of arrests. Wester was systematically encouraged by department policy to make as many arrests as possible. And when he couldn't find reasons to arrest people, he manufactured them. Zachary Wester's department sent the message to its officers that it valued making arrests, which encourages officers to find reasons to arrest people.
So right now our metric is arrest. That's what judges an officer. So we have to change the metric to crime reduction, to justice, to problem solving, because you should be focused on improving your post, not on locking of many of those people up, because if you're taking their freedom away, how are you not going to be their enemy?
This is an example of a policy that breeds a warrior culture. If you reward officers based on the number of arrests made, property seized, or cases closed, you are encouraging them to hunt the wolves. And if there aren't any wolves, officers are incentivized to find some. This will encourage them to employ more and more drastic measures to find an actual wolf, a large coyote, or just a menacing-looking husky. However, if you reward officers based on community trust, reductions in crime, or the well-being of citizens, then you are encouraging completely different behavior. It's important to incentivize officers to follow the goals that we actually want to pursue. If wolves are eating your livestock, you shouldn't reward the farmers that kill more wolves. You should reward the ones that protect more livestock. Likewise, you should reward officers that manage to reduce crime and improve the lives of residents, because encouraging them to hunt wolves is a great example of a perverse incentive. Go ahead and Google the Cobra effect to see how those policies turn out. The reason many departments don't already use better metrics is because it's often harder to track. The amount of crime can be skewed by the likelihood of people to report it, and the well-being of citizens isn't really quantifiable. The number of arrests, however, is pretty easy to keep track of. But while these shortcuts might be convenient, they distract officers from the things we actually want them to do. Departments and city officials need to dedicate money and resources into continuously measuring and surveying things like community trust, life outcomes, and the local economic and human impact of crime. But while changing the incentive structure for officers could be helpful in reinforcing better values, there's more to organizational culture than just incentives. Culture is largely about the attitudes and beliefs of an organization, and these are often influenced by the stories and myths perpetuated by its leaders and its members. A good culture requires these legends to reinforce correct beliefs that move individual attitudes towards a more helpful mentality. To understand the culture currently saturating many departments, let's return to the work of Rosa Brooks, a law professor who attended police academy training. Week after week, we watched footage of cops getting attacked, injured, or killed. The world, it seemed, was a dangerous place for police officers. They were perpetually being stabbed, shot, punched, kicked, run over, drowned, poisoned by fentanyl, and bitten by savage dogs. The instructors referred to these as officer safety videos. When we had breaks or got ahead of the curriculum and had nothing else to do, which happened a lot, we huddled around iPads and laptops and watched more videos, like kids bonding over their favorite YouTube clips. recruits sat around in the lunchroom and swapped suggestions of cops in trouble videos to watch. The dead cops were all heroes, but it was quietly intimated they were also failures. Mostly, we were told, they died because they weren't prepared. The stories of cops perpetually fighting for their lives were told and retold throughout training. As a result, the recruits began repeating and adding to these stories themselves until it became the obsessive focus of the academy. And in the recruits' minds, these stories evolved into the idea that officers are always in danger, and the only solution is to have your finger on the trigger, ready for violence at all times. Stories become culture. Culture becomes belief, and belief, so very often, turns into action. If we want to course correct the culture and beliefs endemic to law enforcement training, instructors and senior officers have to tell different stories. Stories about officers who save lives instead of take them. Officers who reach out with empathy and respect to make their community a better place to be. If young officers are trained on stories and legends of police work being an endless series of kill or be killed encounters, the inevitable result is killing. And whenever you have stories and myths, they're also accompanied by symbols and icons for an organization to rally around. Of course, law enforcement is no exception, and there are many symbols that police often gravitate towards. The thin blue line that suggests police are the only barrier between society and anarchy. The idea of the lonely sheepdog protecting the flock from the wolves at the gate. And of course, both of these started out as military symbols, because inappropriately copying the military seems to be a recurring theme here. Speaking of which, don't forget the Spartan helmet, reinforcing the idea that the police are a military force fighting an impossible battle to save civilization as we know it. And the Blue Lives Matter flag, representative of a counter-movement to make violence against police officers a hate crime. That's not really the kind of thing hate crime laws were designed to protect, but it reinforces the idea that law enforcement is special and fundamentally different from the rest of society. And that idea infects law enforcement especially well. But the most insidiously common warrior culture symbol of all is easily the Punisher logo. The idea of a lone warrior ignoring sheep society's rules to hunt down and snuff out who he believes to be the wolves fits with the warrior mentality almost too well. Not only is it indicative of the effects of a warrior culture, but this symbol can also teach us a lot about how stories and myths reinforce organizational culture and beliefs. Anyone familiar with the comics knows that Frank Castle has a long history of deranged violence and has made being a serial killer his life's work. He was intentionally created as a bad guy. Anytime you see a police officer rocking a Punisher logo, know that they either know nothing about the Punisher or they know nothing about law enforcement. Unfortunately, it's very often the second one. So, what's an alternative kind of hero worship? What's the example that should be followed? Easy. A better comic book protagonist. One that's liked, respected, and unassailably good. Some of you might want to say Captain America, but please don't, because law enforcement does not need another soldier to model itself after. Also, surprisingly, shockingly perhaps, the answer is not going to be Batman. The better answer is Superman. When Superman enters the room, everyone else in that room knows that they are now safer. Is it because of Superman's powers? Absolutely not. If Hannibal Lecter had the same powers, you would not feel safe in a room with him. It's because we know that Superman refuses to let anyone get hurt but him. His very presence de-escalates situations because of his reputation for unrelenting patience and self-sacrifice. And when there is a genuine threat to his life, when he's going up against kryptonite, magic, or just an immense level of power, his goals and strategy do not change. He doesn't start lasering people's heads off the moment someone pulls out a green rock. He fanatically uses the minimum level of force. That's why people respect him. Not because of his strength, or his victories, or even the number of people he's saved, but because of the empathy and respect that he shows to everyone he meets. And yeah, I get that holding people to the standards of a fictional character is unfair, and I'm not suggesting we imprison any officer that isn't utterly perfect all the time. But that level of goodness should at least be the goal that we strive towards. Superman exists to save people and help his community, not deal out punishment. He takes the time to understand the needs of his community and is aware that violence is the last tool that should be used. He knows that he has a kind of power over others, and he is determined to use it to make society a better place and to never abuse it. Superman is a great model for guardian mentality, and he has one of the most widely recognized and least controversial symbols on the planet. Way better than an angry skull. And if you don't like Superman, then may I suggest Sheriff Andy Taylor from The Andy Griffith Show. A character that embodies compassion and patience and understands that maintaining the respect of his community is infinitely more important than being skilled at dealing out violence. Here's a video showing why Sheriff Andy Taylor is the perfect example of community policing and why he was almost systematically punished for it. Does art imitate life, or does life imitate art? You decide. So if you want to hero worship a fictional character, there you go. Now take the Punisher decal off your squad car! The challenge we face is not just about changing the laws or policies around policing. It's about changing the culture, mentality, stories, and symbols that pervade the profession. Community policing is not enough. Additional training is not enough. But they can both be used as pieces of a puzzle that can ultimately right the ship. Different training, community policing, empowering early adopters, political will, legislative changes, new law enforcement leadership, and other factors are all necessary to truly fix this problem. And some departments have already instituted many of these changes. I gave numerous examples of bad police or department behavior in this video, and there are many more that I didn't have time to cover. But for every instance of exceptionally bad behavior, I'm sure you can find an example of exceptionally good behavior, of an officer truly embodying the guardian mentality and going above and beyond to make their community the kind of place where fewer people resort to crime. A lot of officers have already learned the lessons I'm talking about, and a lot of cities and departments have already made many of these changes. And yes, it does work. The culture and mindset can shift. It just takes time, effort, money, and a willingness to change. There is no magic bullet to fix police brutality. It will take a combined effort from community leaders to politicians to forward-thinking officers to private citizens to truly make change happen. And it will only become permanent when we're able to alter the very fabric of American policing. The hope is that sustained efforts to create a cultural change will lead to better values amongst departments and officers. If you want to learn more about what a better police force might look like, I've included links in the description to resources about how officers have changed their departments for the better. Creating better values will lead to different priorities, and those priorities can make law enforcement safer and more productive, not just for suspects and officers, but for everyone. Also, if you like the kind of content that YouTube might want to demonetize occasionally, please support me on Patreon so I can keep making these videos and expanding the scope of my channel. Also, thanks for watching all the way to the end of this series. Nice job.